We're glad to have you this morning. I do want to just do a couple housekeeping things before we get started, if that's okay.
Sure.
So my name is Andrea Cruz. I am a part of the STM Connection conference today, and I work with a ministry called Touch the World. And we are hosting the culture training for short-term missions track today because a lot of what we do within our ministry is training for short-term missions. And we're really delighted to be able to have Professor Ross share with us today. I think our topic on Christian nationalism and missions is really important and valuable for us right now to be discussing. And I'm really glad that SOE and the STM decided to include this in our again. Just housekeeping things, we'd love for you to just make sure that you keep yourself on mute throughout the workshop. If you have questions, you feel free to post those in the chat box. And we'll leave about 10 minutes for question and answer at the end of the workshop as well. And then I'll also be posting at the end an evaluation link if you wouldn't mind filling that out and giving some feedback to the conference. Those who are putting the conference together, we'd really appreciate that. So I will pass it over to Professor Ra, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Really appreciate the chance for us to be here together today. And thank all of you who are in this workshop, but also doing the good work in ministry and in missions throughout. Our topic today is on Christian nationalism, and I didn't think it would be actually helpful to talk about the details of that in the sense of, do we go over who are the players and what's going on specifically, versus getting a bigger picture perspective on not just Christian nationalism, but other aspects of narratives, and that's the language I'm going to use, narratives, worldview, perspectives that have ended up shaping the way missions is understood, the way cross-cultural interaction is understood. So again, we're going to take a big picture view on this, and then as we're going through this, what I'm hoping is we will find the specific application, particularly in the area of Christian nationalism, et cetera. So that's my kind of agenda for today, for us to begin the process of understanding the larger framework behind some of these dysfunctional narratives, as I'm going to define them, that we find in our cultural context that could be and has been a hindrance to the work of the gospel throughout the world, and actually even in the US itself, there's been some problematic aspects of that. So, and again, we hope to have about 10-15 minutes of Q&A at the end as well. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to take a look at the idea of changing the narrative, meaning we need to understand what that narrative is. So here is the contact information if you want to follow up with me afterwards, esra@fuller.edu. Let me begin with two kind of practical theology concepts and frameworks that might help us to better understand our topic. And the first is, how do you do a practical theology that actually works in our ministry context? So this is the work of Holland and Henrio, who are two Catholic theologians, and it was modified and adapted by the work of Eldon Villafañe, who is a Reformed Pentecostal ethicist at Gordon Conwell, recently retired. But he was, they're examining, how do you do practical theology? In other words, how do you take the important work of theology that we do oftentimes in seminaries or in our conversations, and how do you make it real? How do you make it actually applicable to our context? So they propose three different categories: clarification, conceptualization, and confrontation, as three important aspects of how we do practical theology. We begin with clarification, which is we need to understand the context of our ministry. What is going on in the world around us? So when we're talking, for example, about Christian nationalism, an important beginning point is to say, okay, how did this come to pass? How was it that you have this kind of narrative that is in place? Or what are these narratives that are in place? So clarification is an important part of practical theology, because in order to apply and make theology actually work on the ground, you have to know what's going on the ground. And so that's that first step understanding our context of ministry. Those of you who do work in missiology, very clearly you know that if you're going to a place where English is not spoken, you need to know what language is spoken, clarification, and what cultural realities there are in that context in order to be more effective. So this is very basic mission 101. Understand the context in which you are serving, in which you are bringing the gospel, so that you can be more effective in communication of that gospel. The second category, and these are all interrelated, they're not like on a linear basis. Again, I'm going to demonstrate that this is actually circular and interconnected to one another. The second is conceptualization, or what we might call the biblical theological truth and biblical theological content. So, by the way, usually when I talk about this, I'm not talking about reworking theology or even changing your theology. What I actually say is we go deeper into our theology. So oftentimes we have kind of a superficial theology that we kind of haphazardly and more generally apply. This conceptualization that Viafane offers is actually go deeper into your theology so that your theology is able to speak to your context. Not that you are watering down your theology to speak to your context, but that you are deepening your theology to speak to your context. So that's the second category. And the third category is confrontation or methods of ministry. How do we apply these concepts to our context? What is the application? What are the key ways of doing ministry in that context? Oftentimes what I find in kind of practical theology is people start with category 3. Let's think of ways to do good things. Let's have these ideas, brainstorm for ideas. And oftentimes they're taken from corporate America or they're taken from other nonprofits. And in the process of creating these methods of ministry, there's two things that oftentimes don't happen is one, clarification, as in we need to know in this context, is that going to work? In this context, what are the unique characteristics which requires that we do some of this work, as well as conceptualization, what's the theological truth that we want to speak to into this context. So those are some of the things that we want to make sure we are engaging these 3 steps in practical theology. And as I said before, this is done not in a linear fashion, as in it's a straight line that moves us from point A to point B, but much more in a circular fashion. They interact and inform one another and engage one another in our conversation around, again, applied practical theology. So keep this in mind as we're going forward. A lot of what we're going to do today is in the clarification section, as in the analysis that helps us to understand the story of Christian nationalism, the analysis of the narratives, the imagination, the worldview that formed a dysfunctional Christian nationalism. And I'm going to offer 1 or 2 things that helps with the theological response, but we're going to focus here on knowing where a lot of this is coming from so that our theological response is deeper and our confrontation is actually speaking to the social reality of where this is coming from. Okay. From this framework, I want to move to another framework that helps us to understand this. And this is the work of how do social systems and social structures come to pass. This is the work of 2 sociologists, Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. Their work is in the 60s and 70s. The book is called The Social Construction of Reality. And then Peter Berger has a book by himself called The Sacred Canopy. And these are kind of classic works in terms of how our social reality comes to pass. These are 2 sociologists who are trying to explain how the world as we see it has come to pass. And they offer 3 different levels of analysis, as in 3 different ways that social reality comes to pass. And so we're trying to understand the social reality of Christian nationalism. We're trying to understand the social reality of a way of looking at the world that seems to be harmful for the work of God's kingdom and the gospel in the world. This type of white nationalism, white Christian nationalism, those are the things we want to understand. And so Berger and Luckman gives us paradigms how better to understand that framework or worldview or imagination that is formed. And they say there are 3 categories: externalization, objectification, institutionalization, and internalization. I'll begin with the externalization piece of it. which is in the externalization process, society, culture, our social reality is formed by the contribution of individuals. And that's where the word externalization comes in. Individuals come into a social system, or individuals help start a social system, and they externalize who they are. They externalize their values, they externalize their ideas, they externalize their life story, they externalize their brokenness, they externalize their spirituality. The individual contributes to that society. So you can think of, I'll use the example of a church plant. I was a church planter for many years, where individuals get together and they externalize into that newly forming community their value system. One person might say, I really appreciate expository preaching, and I would like the expository preaching to be a part of our social culture or church culture. Another person might say, I come from a church that has contemporary worship, and I like to see that as part of our church culture. Or maybe someone says, I come from a church that didn't do much work in the community and didn't really care about the needs of the neighborhood, but I would like to see our church do that. So different individuals are coming into a social context, whether that's a church that's starting, or a mission organization, or a nation, or a neighborhood, or a school. And they are coming in and trying to influence or shape that culture and society and social group with the externalization of their life, their value system, who they are, into the system. Now, typically, and I would say more specifically in evangelical circles and in kind of Western cultural contexts, this is the primary mode of social change. Individuals. It's kind of an individualistic culture, Western culture as well as evangelical culture in the West. We believe that the world changes if you have good individuals changing that society. And I'm not saying that that's not true. That is true. Individuals can shape that society, but there are two factors here. One, the externalization of the individual can be good because we're all made in the image of God, and we externalize the good that is within us because we're made in the image of God. But we know through the doctrine of Scripture and the doctrine of the Imago Dei, as well as the doctrine of harmoniology and biblical anthropology, that human beings are not only made in the image of God, but also have a sinful, fallen nature. And so when an individual comes into a system, you cannot assume that that individual is only going to externalize the good. As in all situations, because of human identity, biblical anthropology, and because of the power of sin in every individual, we always externalize both the good, the image of God and the Spirit of God in us, but also the evil and the sinful and broken, because we are all fallen human beings. So it's the recognition that the individual contribution to society can be both good and bad. That's one piece of it. The second piece of it is that that's not the end of the story. That even as an individual shapes that society, shapes that culture, shapes the worldview of others, shapes the church, shapes the mission agency, that is not a sufficient analysis of how that society, how that church, how that mission organization comes to pass. Because there are two other levels, as Berger and Luckman point out. And the second level is the objectification and institutionalization of that system. So you have an individual contributing to the system, and you have a system or an institution that takes on a life of its own, separate from the individuals that started the system in the first place. So think of it this way. You have a church plant. I was a church planter back in 1996, and I pastored and planted that church for 10 years. And in the course of those 10 years, the 7, 8 people that helped start the church, most of us moved on. I think 7 out of 8 moved on. So what we're seeing, and this is very common in church plants, is that when a church plant starts, those who helped found the church plant oftentimes move on to do different things. And you see schools that were started by a group of individuals. You see denominations, mission agencies, started by these individuals who externalize their value into the system. But the system does take on a life of its own. And hopefully, in both good and bad systems, outlive the individuals that started that system in the first place. So now you have institutionalized the system, And now the system has a life of its own, separate from those individuals, and it continues on as a separate institution or as a separate system or structure. So what that means is that that system and structure has the capacity to, in the same way that the individual does, exhibit the image of God because of the individuals that contributed to it, but also the capacity to exhibit sinful and broken human nature. And this is what Reinhold Niebuhr points out in his book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, that institutions, when they take on a life of its own, have a morality that is different from individual morality. And so even if you were to see morality in the individual, that doesn't always translate into social morality or ethic. Morality is found in the individual, you could argue that, but the transition into the institutional life doesn't always happen because individual morality doesn't always automatically transfer into social morality. So again, the issue here is, does an institution, does a system or a structure have the capacity to take on a life of its own? And I would argue, yes, it does, because I think it's in scripture. When we look at Ephesians chapter 6, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities of this present darkness. And so what the Apostle Paul seems to be alluding to here is not that individuals aren't sinful, or that individuals can shape and influence systems and structures, but that there is a level of life, a level of existence that goes beyond the flesh and blood individual, and what is described as powers, principalities, and I would argue that these are demonic powers, and that what Paul seems to be describing in Ephesians 6 is not only the presence of sin in the individual, but the presence of evil in the systems and structures. So this is what I mean by going deeper in our theology. My education at Gordon Conwell and my framework of theology has been very much the Reformed tradition. And one of the central key tenets of the Reformed tradition is human fallenness. It's number one. It's the T of the tulip. It is very important to understand the reality of human sinfulness and human brokenness. What we have to see then, by going deeper into our faith, is the capacity of sin and evil and the demonic to not only be in the individual, but also to be in the systems and structures. So this is this comes from my personal background. I am fourth generation Southern Baptist. My great grandfather and my grandmother, their family, was one of the first converts to the Baptist church and the missionaries in Pyongyang, which was actually the center of missionary life prior to the Korean War. But Pyongyang was where a lot of missionaries were, and my family heritage is that they were one of the first converts and joined the Baptist church. So I'm fourth generation Southern Baptist. But I also grew up in a church that had a lot of Pentecostal influences. So I'm half Southern Baptist and half Pentecostal, which makes me a perfect professor for Fuller, I think. But I remember growing up as a Southern Baptist and Pentecostal and being a youth pastor in this context. And we just had the best youth retreats you can imagine, right? Both Southern Baptists and Pentecostals and the youth retreat. Because that first night, we were good Southern Baptists. We led everybody to Christ. We did the sinner's prayer. Everybody walks down the aisle, and we do the good Southern Baptist thing of leading these individuals to Christ. And then the second night, because we're Pentecostal, we would have our, yearly youth retreat exorcisms. So that was our both and. We did both the personal salvation and our exorcisms. So what was always interesting to me now, 30 years later, looking back on those moments, of how dynamic those moments were, because these youth were really coming to faith, I believe. But I stop and think about, okay, what was going on with that kind of the demon casting out? Because I do believe in demons. I believe in demonic powers. It's too evident in the Bible. Those of you who've been in different contexts outside of the West, you can't deny the reality of demons in the world. But what I remember at this youth retreat is that we would pray for the demon of lust Oh no, there are four demons of lust. Oh, then we start naming them. There are four demons of lust in this 14-year-old boy. And we pray and we fast and we cast out four demons of lust in the 14-year-old boy. And now, many years later, as a parent of a teenager, I really have to question, did a 14-year-old boy need four demons of lust to be lustful? Because as far as I can tell, 14-year-old boys do not need any help whatsoever, certainly not four demons, to be lustful. That's just kind of the way teenage boys are at that point in their life. And don't try this at home. I have 4 theological degrees, so I can do this, but I play a game called If I Were Satan, What Would I Do? So again, don't try this at home. I'm trained for this. If I were Satan, what would I do? If I were Satan, and I had a limited number of demons at my disposal, and that is true, that's biblical, there's a limited number of demons in the world, would I really send 4 demons into a 14-year-old boy in Northern Virginia? Would that be a really good use of my resources? Or would it make more sense to take those demons and put them into the systems and structures of our world? And so this is what I mean by going deeper in our theology. If we have a theology of sin, we have to recognize that sin is not just found in the individual, but sin is also found in the systems and structures of our society. And so that's why I really kind of don't get it when Christians are the ones that are saying, oh, we believe in individual sin, like racism or prejudice, but we don't believe in systemic racism. And my take is, as Christians, we actually should go deeper into that. If we believe sin is found in the individual, therefore it has individual racist and individual prejudice, then the sin of racism could very easily be found in the systems and structures of our society. So this is the social analysis that I'm advocating for, is when we look at a problem like Christian nationalism, we don't just look at it through the lens of the individual and say, oh, that's a bad person. That might be true. That's a sinful person. That might be true. But we really need to look at what are the systems and structures that allow this to happen? What are the systems and structures that might actually perpetuate this? And those systems and structures might be in our nation, in our government, it might be in our neighborhood, and it might be in our churches and in our denominations and in our mission agencies. That there might be not just individual brokenness, sinfulness, and fallenness, but there's also systemic and structural brokenness and fallenness. And for this, I oftentimes quote John 3:16, for God so loved the world. And the word world is cosmos. And the word cosmos is not an individual. And again, I was a youth pastor. I did this when it was time for the altar call. I would quote John 3:16, for God so loved the world. And you know what that means? And this is not true. This is true. God, that means God loves you, Johnny. God loves you, Jane. God loves you, Mary. And it's true. I'm not saying that's not true. But the passage doesn't actually say that. The passage says God so loved the world and cosmos, and this is the work of Stephen Mott, a biblical ethicist at Gordon Conwell, retired now. But what he points out is that the word cosmos, he's a New Testament scholar and a biblical ethicist, the word cosmos is not an individual reflection. That means the world, the spiritual forces, the structures and systems of the world, and not just the individual. So there is a structural systemic element to the need to have conversations around these kinds of problems. It's not just the individual change, we must also address the social systemic change. And Stephen Mott puts it this way, we must confront evil in its proper geography. We must know the geography of evil. And if evil is in the individual, then let's confront it. But if evil is in the systems and structures, we are also called to confront evil and brokenness in the sins of the systems and structures as well as in the individual. So these two categories, the category of individual brokenness and systemic structural brokenness, it's a both and. Now, I will say this, having been in both evangelical and mainline circles, the generalization, I'm offering a generalization, is that evangelicals are really good at focusing on individual transformation. And many mainline tend to focus on social structural transformation. And oftentimes there's a divide, and that's actually historical for 100 years since the early 20th century. you see this kind of what's called the Great Divorce, a Great Reversal, sorry, the work of the historian, his name will come to me in a minute, but the separation between personal evangelism and social justice as separate entities, because one's looking at the change in individuals and the other's looking at change in systems. But for 1900 years of church history, up until about the last 100 years in American church history, those two have always gone side by side and hand in hand. Evangelistic personal efforts and social structural change were the flip sides of the same coin. You see this in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 6, Acts chapter 15. You see this in the early church, according to it'll come to me. He's a Baylor professor, and he writes about the changes that occurred in the early church that led to the growth of the church. Rodney Stark writes about this in The Rise of Christianity. You see this over and over again, that evangelism and justice were not separated out, and really has really been in the last 100 years, particularly in the US context, where the two were separated out. So I've always been an advocate for both and. Let's do personal evangelism, but let's also look at problems in the systems and structures. But I've recently been kind of enamored or really thinking through this third level of social analysis. And that's what Berger and Luckman call internalization. And in internalization, institutions, systems, and structures with both the good and the demonic influences, now individuals come into that institution and they begin to be shaped by that institution. And they begin to internalize the values of that institution or that system and structure. This is, an example is this is what happened in evangelical Christianity over the last 100 years, where there was a particular system and structure of evangelicalism, and there were teaching, and there was books and conferences, and a culture of evangelicalism began to develop, and individuals came into that system and began to internalize the narratives, the ideas, the lifestyle of that system. Now, some of that was good, such as holiness, such as read your Bible every day, such as be involved in a small group. Those were good values that got internalized by being part of that system. You learned the narratives of that system. And that's what internalization is. Your imagination, your worldview, your narrative gets internalized, and it gets shaped and formed by the system that you're in. And again, it can be good and bad. So that institutions now produce individuals with these values. And this is where I want to talk about the power of narratives before we start talking about the influence on Christian nationalism in particular. The power of narratives. Narratives get formed and they shape the way you view the world. Their stories, their patterns of behavior, their teachings, their discipleship, spiritual formation. This is all part of narratives that an institution continues to operate in, and it begins to form the individuals as they internalize these narratives. So again, the social construct of reality requires all of these to work together. So what I want to talk about is yes, we need to confront evil in the geography of the individual so that we change the externalization process, but we also need to confront the geography of evil in the systems and structure in the institutionalization stage. But I'm going to advocate today to really examine the third category. How do we bring change, and how do we confront evil in the geography of internalization, which I would argue are narratives, imagination, and worldview that gets internalized into who we are. So I'll give you an example of this. And I'm going to define narratives and imagination a little more deeply in just a minute and tie this into our conversation today. And this comes from my research around narratives and structures. So as I was thinking through in American church history, this is specifically American church history, what's the most evil system and structure that has existed in American history? And one could argue, and I think reasonably, to say it was slavery. Slavery is the most evil system that American society has ever produced. And of course, there were these factors. There was the individuals who helped to form the slave trade, but it also became an institutionalized system. It's very obvious. There was a structure in place that affirmed slavery. So the institutional piece. But I would argue that there was a narrative that was also at play in the system and structure of slavery. So all three were needed to retain and continue and maintain the system and the dysfunctional evil system of slavery. And because it was an evil system, it needed systemic confrontation. So we had a civil war, the 13th Amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation, Juneteenth. These were all systemic confrontations to tear down the evil system of slavery. And we know historically that slavery as a system ended because the structural confrontation of the Civil War, 13th Amendment, et cetera, ended the system and structure of slavery. However, what we also know in history is that a different form of oppression, especially against African Americans, arose in the form of Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws also had that systemic structural reality because they had these individuals externalizing the sinfulness that led to Jim Crow laws. These Jim Crow laws clearly got institutionalized and embedded into the system and structure, and then it also became a part of the narrative of American life. And so Jim Crow laws have this evil system that comes into place. And to be blunt, in many cases, Jim Crow laws were almost as effective as slavery. It disenfranchised the Black vote. It created a second-tier citizenship, maybe not ownership, but certainly in terms of economic and in terms of limitations of opportunity, Jim Crow created a severe caste system in American society. And so Jim Crow took the place of slavery as a system. So we needed another systemic confrontation, and that comes through the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. All of these things that we saw in the 60s and 70s confronted the evil of Jim Crow, evil system of Jim Crow. And we know that structurally, Jim Crow, as it existed for about 100 plus years, came to an end with the Civil Rights Movement. However, what we have seen is that there has been the implementation of a new Jim Crow, new forms of racial oppression that, okay, in the same way that Jim Crow was not quite as bad as slavery, but pretty bad, the new Jim Crow is maybe not quite as bad as Jim Crow, but also pretty bad. And again, same process, externalization, institutionalization, internalization. And so the new Jim Crow, in many ways, has been just as effective as the old Jim Crow. So for example, the representation of African Americans in the Senate is abysmally low. And the representation of African Americans in the higher places of government, abysmally low. The attempts to suppress the Black vote, the attempts to, these are all these kind of social realities, the mass incarceration of Black men. These are all social realities that seem to indicate that some of the things that Jim Crow tried to do, the new Jim Crow is also trying to do. And so the question is, these structures and systems keep getting swapped out. Slavery gets replaced by Jim Crow. Jim Crow gets replaced by the new Jim Crow. These engines of oppression continue to change, but yet they still exist. Why? Because the fuel that drove these engines are still at work. So even if you swap out the individual and say, oh, this individual was bad as a president or as a mayor, as a sheriff, let's get rid of that individual and bring in a new individual. Or even you swap out the whole system and structure and say, hey, we had a system of Jim Crow in this neighborhood. We're going to pass laws to make sure that they don't happen again. You still have left that third piece, the internalized imagination and narratives. That has not been changed. So it's like taking an engine, dismantling and throwing out all the parts and say, we don't want that engine, that slavery engine, we don't like it at all. But you build a new engine because you still have the fuel that fueled the old engine. So the fuel remains, and it keeps fueling new engines of oppression. And so that is why I'm arguing is the power of internalization. When narratives, imagination, worldview gets embedded into the world in such a way that you operate out of those embedded narratives. And so these mediating narratives, in the language of Walter Wink, these mediating narratives are internalized so that even if the system isn't there, you're going to rebuild that system because you're operating out of those narratives. A few examples of this in kind of the Western Christian mind. What are the narratives that shape the Western Christian mind? This is coming from my most recent book with Mark Charles, Native American activist and pastor. We wrote a book called Unsettling Truths, and we examine these existing narratives that have been around for centuries that have shaped the American Western Christian worldview, but also the missionary enterprise has oftentimes been shaped by these perspectives. In fact, I was very thankful that Unsettling Truth received an award from ASM, American Society of Missiologists. We didn't write it as a missiology book. We wrote it more as a historical reflection on especially the Native American experience with American Christianity, with Western Christianity. But thank you, ASM, for willing to put that on the list of books. So we were very honored by that, because what we're trying to do is unpack the narratives that have shaped and formed Western culture, Western Christianity, but I would also argue it has also formed and shaped Western missiology. And so what we do is we look at the doctrine of discovery as one of the key social, historical, political features that shaped Western Christianity and the Western imagination and the narratives around missiology, narratives around church, narratives around Western culture. And just a quick primer, the Doctrine of Discovery was a series of papal bulls, a series of edicts and proclamations. When you say papal bull, it actually means almost like the voice of God himself. So the Doctrine of Discovery was a series of them that formed this dual doctrine, meaning it had two purposes. One was, it was a theological doctrine, but it also was a political, geopolitical doctrine. So it's like the doctrine of the Imago Dei, in that sense of the word, a theological doctrine, but it also was like the Monroe Doctrine or the Bush Doctrine, a doctrine of how one governs relationships with one another, national relationships. And so the Doctrine of Discovery, first set of the doctrine was sent to the King of Portugal, King Alfonso, and to his uncle, Prince Henry, whom is also called the Navigator. And Henry the Navigator was one of the progenitors of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, he was one who actually was one of the first to take slaves from Africa and then bring the slaves to the New World. And so this doctrine of discovery, this series of papal bulls that gets sent out to King Alfonso, essentially affirms the work of Prince Henry to go and to take Africans as slaves. And the theological justification of that, again, this is a political doctrine that comes out of a theological doctrine. The theological justification that was offered was European bodies are really the image of God. And so when you encounter these pagans and Saracens and these individuals, they're not quite the image of God. So part of it is you're going to evangelize to them, but at the end of the day, they're not fully human like you are fully human. So there's this dysfunctional theological doctrine that clearly leads to this dysfunctional political doctrine that actually, again, leads to the transatlantic slave trade. So that's the first half of the Doctrine of Discovery. It was actually gave a theological justification for this for slavery because it was seen, Black bodies were seen as less valuable than white bodies. The second set actually goes to the King of Spain, and specifically to Ferdinand and Isabella and to their servant, who we know by the name of Christopher Columbus. So it is written by the Pope to Ferdinand and Isabella and to the Spanish Empire. Very similar theological language that was used to justify the slave trade now is used in Spain's conquest of the New World, of the Americas. And the idea is that you are really, Ferdinand, Isabella, Christopher Columbus, you are really endowed with the image of God. You have the Spirit of God in you. So when you encounter others, they are not quite that way. So they are less than human. And so that's why Columbus discovers America. How do you discover a nation or a continent that probably had about 6 to 10 million people and probably had approximately 2,000 different civilizations? How do you discover a land? Well, if you believe in the empty land or a blank slate, tabula rasa or telenovela, you believe that even though there are bodies that occupy the Americas, those aren't really human bodies, because our Pope has just told us that we're really the human beings made in the image of God. And in the same way, the Portuguese started the slave trade based upon this warped, diseased doctrine of discovery, the conquest of the New World essentially meant the genocide of the native communities. And so this is forming an imagination. This is forming a narrative around how we understand the world. And it gets acted out through the slave trade. It gets enacted through the conquest of the New World. It's the narrative that is spoken of in sermons, such as John Winthrop's sermon, when he comes to the New World and he looks over the Boston and he says, what? I see a city set on a hill, taken straight out of the book of Matthew. And this is a sermon. And what he's talking about is, hey, we're going to build this great Christian nation and Christian nationalism. We're going to build this great Christian nation. And therefore, those who are here already, they're inconsequential. In fact, they're obstacles to this great Christian nation we're going to build, because we're trying to build a city set on a hill that gives light to the world. And when there are red bodies in our space, then we have a right to remove those red bodies. And so that becomes an imagination, a worldview, a narrative that gets embedded into these systems and structures. And what I'm arguing for is that these narratives got embedded into our worldview in such a way that Christian nationalism, the type of nationalism that centers Euro-American bodies, this is not just something that just came out of the last 4 or 5 years. There are deeply embedded narratives and imagination on how we look at ourselves as an American nation, how we look at ourselves as Western Christians, how we look at ourselves as Western Christians vis-a-vis non-Western Christians, how the European body views itself compared to the Black body, the brown body, other bodies. And those narratives and imagination gets embedded in, internalized, so that we operate out of those imaginations. I'm running out of time, so I won't go into this, the myth of the Anglo-Saxon. I would just refer you to Kelly Brown Douglas's work, Standing Your Ground, which does an excellent job of tracing this myth of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant purity that goes back to the Pilgrims and the Puritans as well. How that idea of white superiority or white supremacy or white centeredness has been a part of this American mythology. And again, Kelly Brown Douglas traces that back to some of this Anglo-Saxon rhetoric and the belief that the Anglo-Saxons are a chosen people, a specific unmixed, pure people group, and therefore the right to defend the grounds they live on. So all of this is part of the narrative that is in American society. And my question is, how are these narratives being played out? And we saw that, if we saw that in the insurrection of 2017, in the January 6th insurrection. We saw a number of people who wanted to take back their country, who believed, and one of the most troubling images that many of us saw during that insurrection was people praying evangelical prayers while they're killing people, while they're putting up scaffolding to hang the vice president and to hang Nancy Pelosi. They're praying evangelical prayers. So clearly there is individual stuff there, but clearly there's systemic and structural problems there. And I would argue there are some narrative imagination problems there. And so how do we then begin to confront these narratives and imaginations? Again, I'm running out of time. I just offer this. You can't stop the power of a narrative with more of the same narrative. And this comes from the work of Peter Senge, but there's some really good kind of ministry observations here. The belief that you are moving in, or the narratives move you in this direction. So the left-hand diagram shows a kind of a tire rolling down a hill or a wheel turning down a hill. Picture this. You're at the middle of that hill, and at the top of the hill is this big tire. And let's call it a tractor trailer tire that's bigger than you are. It's huge. And it's hollowed out, and it starts rolling down the hill. And you look at the bottom of the hill, and there's your pet dog. And you're terrified because if that thing keeps going, the dog is going to get run over. So you've got a couple of options. The first thing you think of is, I will be the heroic individual, and I will externalize my body into the system, and I will stop it like this. I will get in front of that tire, and me, the heroic individual, will bring about the change with my heroic individual self and stop it. And what's going to happen? the tire is going to just run over you, and the individual is going to be a pancake as the tire runs over you. So, okay, maybe the individual thing doesn't work. What I need to do then is actually maybe jump into the tire. That's what I'll do. I'll jump into the tire and I'll try to stop this system. I'm going to try to change the system. But what happens is that the system is too powerful and the system continues on. In fact, you end up being caught up in the system and maybe even contributing to that system. And you start rolling down that hill. And so you try these strategies, change the individual, change the system and structure, and both of these fail to work. Maybe what we need to do is to change the narrative, change the imagination, so that if the movement is going in this direction, we create a movement in this direction. If there is a white centrality, white primacy narrative, if there's an American-centric narrative that is out there, then we create diverse narratives. We create multicultural, multi-ethnic narratives. If there's a narrative that said that centers the white European body as superior, the white European mind as superior, the white European spirituality as superior, you create other narratives that demonstrate that there is a different way of looking at the world. So let me pause there. I didn't get to quite everything that I needed to, but I think we have enough to maybe have a few question and answer or question and response about the content so far. And realizing I threw a lot of stuff out there, but let's see where we can go with this. Any questions? Just unmute yourself or pop up your hand and any clarification or questions in general.
So how do you think, I mean, obviously you have studied this and are very entrenched in it, but how would we as individual believers begin to shape a new narrative? I mean, it almost sounds like, are you downplaying the work of the Lord in our life as transforming our mind?
Well, that's what I mean by all levels, the geography of evil. So the capacity to confront evil in all these spaces. And so what I'm arguing is that we've gotten some of the handle on individual change and systemic structural change. We're not as well versed in narrative change. Now, narrative change in the negative that we've seen will probably, hopefully work in the positive, right? So how did these narratives of white supremacy, how did these narratives of human brokenness around Christian nationalism, all of these narratives that I'm arguing frame some of this dysfunctional expression, how did those narratives get formed? Well, there was probably some bad discipleship. There was probably some bad systems and structures, probably bad communication, bad formation that occurred. So what would it look like to create different formation, a different form of transformation? And different forms of systems and structures. So that's why I'm kind of advocating along with Dr. Mott, confront evil in its proper geography. And to me, proper geography is all three levels. So yes, God is able to transform the individual, but if it's just external behavior and not internal narratives and imagination, then that was not sufficient. We need to do the internalized imagination transformation as well. So, back in the day, we used to say, hey, what's a good Christian? Well, a good Christian doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, doesn't, and don't date girls who smoke and drink, right? That was the old mantra in the 50s. That's how we define what a good Christian is. Well, that changes behavior, but it doesn't change the heart. It doesn't change the internalized worldview. And so we can change behaviors by saying, oh, let's send some kids on a short-term mission trip and they have a certain behavior they exhibit for 2 weeks. But if their narrative hasn't changed, they're going to come back and revert back to a lifestyle that's been the same for the last 15, 16 years. And that's what you see over and over again, right? You see folks who will have an individual short-term transformation. They won't change the system, but their narratives also aren't changed. And they come back and they revert back to different behavior because you change behavior for the short term, but you didn't change the internalized narratives. So I believe in a God who can do all three. That's my contention. I don't believe in a God who can just do one. I believe in a God who can do all three.
Professor Ra, I'm curious on your take on how do we engage our younger generation and Gen Z in missions when they're so turned off by the white evangelical church right now, specifically because of the picture of Christian nationalism and that
Yeah.
narrative that they're hearing within the church?
Yeah.
How do we still keep them engaged
Yeah.
in this call, this biblical call to mission, but
Yeah.
helping them differentiate the idea that it's not actually
Yeah.
this picture, that the narrative that's playing out in your church?
Right. Well, that's to me is the question of the hour, which is what are the counter narratives that confront the dysfunctional narratives, right? So what I find among, especially the young people, and it depends. It's not all everyone, but more and more young people, I would argue, they see these broken narratives played out, patriarchy, racism, Western cultural chauvinism. They see that played out a lot. Authoritarianism. They're seeing these again. Basically, a lot of it is kind of put upon white evangelicalism as the poster child of these dysfunctions. So we have a lot of folks who I think in some cases justified are going to walk away from that because it's too painful. It's too harmful. It's too toxic. And I generally speaking, I don't speak against that because I feel like, you've had a tough time. You have the right to walk away. But I would like to see not just the walking away, but the formation of new narratives, right? What do counter narratives look like? So, and this is true, in the early 20th century, in the mid 20th century, a big reason that evangelists and missionaries were able to draw some of the Americans into mission enterprises was anti-communism. Now, I'm not saying that's bad or good. I'm just saying that's a historical reality. Billy Graham's career really got started with his anti-communist, sermons in Los Angeles. That was his, and then a number of the media picked up on it and actually elevated into this kind of national status. That's just a historical, reality. And so you had these narratives that drew people into, hey, we need to go to these countries to help the stop of communism, or we need to, this is atheism, so we need to stop that. And again, it worked to a large extent. I am not sure that narrative is going to sell to the next generation. One, because the world is so different now, right? I mean, it's just, Putin's not a communist. He's an oligarch. He's a dictator. But economically, he's not a communist. That's just, communism is not what it was in the 1950s. This is just a totally different thing right now. So, to say, oh, let's fight Putin for communist sake, and we need to send missionaries to the Ukraine, I don't think that's going to work. However, there are places where the current generation would say, I want to see God there. And I think environmental justice is one of those places. I know that I see that in my daughter, where, she's finding an expression for environmental justice. It's not in the church. It's with her friends. It's with, she actually goes to a Christian school, but they have these groups where they talk about environmental justice and sustainability. That's her major. So they're finding a thing that they want to get engaged in. It's just not the narratives that we had before. The narratives we had before was, let's make America great and send missionaries out there because American greatness will mean kingdom greatness, or Christian greatness is because of American greatness. That's not going to fly. First of all, it hasn't worked. And second, younger generations like, well, that led to Korean War, Vietnam War, World War II, and the Iraq War, and Gulf War II. I mean, the list goes on and on of how American greatness does not equal world greatness or Christian greatness, church greatness. We just haven't seen it. And so what are the spaces where a younger generation connects? And I do think things like environmental justice, and I would say racial justice, where younger people are much more diverse in their demographic makeup, right? And we all know this. The statistic that I've been quoting is that according to the census, next year, 2023, actually, half the children in America will be children of color. So we're talking, and it's a dual thing, and that's birth rate change, right? Birth rate in 2011, I believe, went from majority white to majority non-white. So, and that's not changing, that keeps going up, which means that then you're going to see it among the children first. And so what we're seeing then is that our children are growing up, teenagers, college students, in a much, much more multi-ethnic context. And if we're feeding them narratives of white supremacy, white centeredness, European culture is the way to do it, America's great, white America is great, white Christian nationalism. If we're feeding them those narratives and they look around and say, actually, no, I don't see it. I see my friend group, my college, my work, my fellow workers in this extraordinarily diverse, in fact, I want to go to a church that reflects that. I'm not going to go to a monoethnic church because that's not the world that I live in. I'm not going to go to a monocultural church because that's not the world that I live in. And so you're creating new narratives, multi-ethnic churches, teams that work together. What Oscar Murillo talks about quite often about reciprocity, that Africa is not just a dumping ground for our mission efforts, but African missionaries should be coming here as well, and they are in larger numbers now. What does that mean? And Oscar Murillo, I believe at Nairobi Chapel has actually done, you're going to send us 15 kids to Nairobi, we're going to send 15 kids to the US. That's how that's going to work. So there's some other ways to change the narrative, but I think looking at what is it that the next generation is passionate about, environmentalism, sexism, racism, diversity, these are things that are important. And again, if we go deeper in our theology, instead of looking at it from the shallow way that we've looked at it before, if we go deeper into our theology, these are all kingdom values. Of course, everyone's made in the image of God, and therefore we respect the culture and race of every individual. And so that's a kingdom value. That's a biblical theological value that we apply to this and create new narratives in the process.
Great. I think we have time for one last question, if you don't mind. There's
Sure.
one in the chat here. It says, what are some practical tips on how you can begin to reframe the narrative within an institution like a church that does not want to acknowledge or engage with alternative narrative?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I get this question a lot. In fact, it's probably the most important question people ask about this. How do we do this? But not just how do we do it? Because in the past it was how do I do this? How do we do this without getting fired? Is probably what's being asked right now. How do I do this without my elder board coming after me? There was a statistic. I think a third of the pastors were ready to quit because some of the things they wanted to talk about in the church they knew they couldn't talk about. And I know of actual case studies and individuals who were, fired from their jobs or contracts not renewed or made to feel very uncomfortable because their elder board or their senior pastor said, we don't talk about that in our church. That's not what happens. I would say different times require different strategies. So for example, a lot of the strategy now has been, if we just have a mega church that's ethnically diverse, that will be the new narrative. I don't know about that. I mean, it's good. It's not bad. I'm not saying that. But that was a strategy that worked for boomers and Gen Xers because that's the culture of boomers and Gen Xers. Big and moneyed and, all this resources and, kind of a showing off of those resources. That's a very boomer Gen X value system, by the way. Collect things and collect people and have this huge parking lot, very boomer and Gen X. I'm going to include myself in that story as well. So that strategy is not going to be the most effective. So what I usually say is, what does a really vibrant small group look like? What does a really vibrant, smaller house church community look like? And so this is what Wolfgang Simpson writes in one of his works about house churches, that the house church movements don't do well in places where there's kind of an empire, Christendom place. So that's Europe and North America, where Christianity has this kind of empire type space. House churches do really well in places of persecution. Middle East, China, as many of you know, has had this explosion of house churches. And the number of house churches in China and the number of Christians there, number of Christians in China through house churches is probably larger than the number of Christians in the US, just because of the explosive growth. Now, why do they do this? Because they're in a very different cultural setting. There's a very different cultural value system. So my main take is, don't try to replicate what the previous generation did to model success. Find new models of success. And that could be house churches. That could be other communities that form, new models of doing things, new ways of doing mission trips, for example. What does a mission trip look like? Well, back in the day, you raised money and you did this. Well, maybe we try something else. What if a mission trip now is meeting halfway with a group? What if a mission trip now is what Oscar Maria says, you said, we receive. Maybe a mission trip now is a Zoom call once a week with people, because, that's where we're at. We don't have to spend lots of money to go somewhere. Now we meet in a in a kind of common space, which could be Zoom. So there's a lot of different ways that things could be done. My caution would be, don't replicate the value system of what made missions work, missions work in a previous generation. Don't replicate that, because what you want to do is find the things that work, and it could be small groups, it could be the kind of outside of the box type of confrontations.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Ra, for your time today. Thank you for the rest of you for joining us for this workshop. If you wouldn't take a mind and just fill out that, that Google form for an evaluation that goes back to the STM Connection, people who are putting this conference on today, they would really appreciate that. And yeah, hope you'll join us for another workshop later this afternoon if you're attending the conference for the rest of the weekend. And thanks again, Professor Ra, for sharing with us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Good to see you all.